Hello, my name is Kellie Jones. I am the Hans Hofmann Professor of Modern Art and Chair of African American and African Diaspora Studies at Columbia University. I'm pleased to welcome you to our program today. On behalf of the Henry Luce Foundation and our hosts at the New York Historical Society, I welcome you to the Conversations on American Art and Museums, a celebration of the Luce American Art Program's 40th anniversary. Since its founding in 1982, the American Art Program has provided support totaling $215 million to 500 museums across all 50 states. It continues to award approximately $7.5 million annually for innovative museum projects in the visual arts. Through this work, Luce seeks to advance the role of visual arts in an open and equitable society and the potential for museums to serve as public forums for art-centered conversations that celebrate creativity, explore difference, and seek common ground. With an eye towards the future and the best possible futures for art museums, these conversations will explore the capacity of art museums to challenge accepted histories and advance the dialogues in which we need to engage with diverse collaborators and communities. So I am so pleased today to welcome you to our conversation, Black Presence and the American Art Museum, with our wonderful collaborators and panelists, Rujeko Hockley, Arnhold, Associate Curator of the Whitney Museum of American Art. Since beginning her tenure at the Whitney, Rujeko Hockley has curated the exhibitions Jennifer Packer, The Eye is Not Satisfied with Seeing, Julie Moretu, and Toyin Oji Odutola, To Wander Determined. Hockley co-curated the 2019 Whitney Biennial and An Incomplete History of Protest, selections from the Whitney's collection, 1940-2017. Previously, as Assistant Curator of Contemporary Art at the Brooklyn Museum, she co-curated We Wanted a Revolution, Black Radical Women, 1965 to 1985, and Crossing Brooklyn, Art from Bushwick, Bed-Stuy, and Beyond. Cameron Shaw is the Executive Director of the California African American Museum. Cameron Shaw began her tenure at CAM as Deputy Director and Chief Curator and was appointed Executive Director in 2021. She previously was Executive Director of New Orleans-based Pelican Bomb, a nonprofit contemporary art organization. Her writing has been widely published, including in the New York Times, Art in America, the New Orleans Times-Picayune, the Los Angeles Review of Books, and Bomb Magazine. She was awarded a Creative Capital Andy Warhol Foundation Arts Writers Grant for short form writing and the Robert Rauschenberg Foundation Art in America Writing Fellowship. So today, as I said, I'm going to welcome our great panelists, and we're going to be talking about Black Presence and the American Art Museum. And as you may have read, the conversation engages the historically ambivalent place of artists of African descent in the American Art Museum and considers what it might portend for us today. So I want to welcome our speakers and say thank you so much for being here before we jump into our first question. Great to see you all. Some of my favorite folks.
Thank you for having us, Kellie.
Absolutely, absolutely. So the first question, thinking with scholars such as Mabel Wilson and Bridget Cooks, we can explore two perhaps competing notions of Black and African American concerns when it comes to the work of what the sociologist Tony Bennett has called the exhibitionary complex. And I love that idea, of the work that exhibitions do. And what he talks about as exhibitions as doing a kind of citizenship work, culture and cultural heritage work, pedagogical work, that exhibitions have performed for Black audiences over the course of the century. Now he uses it, I just ascribe it to Black people in my fashion. But for both Bridget Cookson and Mabel Wilson, they discuss the investment that Black people and early curators, and particularly Mabel Wilson in her book, Negro Building, she points out that W.E.B. Du Bois and Alain Locke both had a real investment. We perhaps, as art historians, know more about Alain Locke, but these people really had a real investment in what the exhibition could do for people of African descent. It would also put, of course, Arturo Schomburg in there as well, in terms of seeing this exhibition model as something that had a place for us. And, you know, they also were invested in the kind of materiality and structure of the museum. So there's that idea that I think, you know, also in Bridget Cook's Exhibiting Blackness, they both talk about it, Mabel Wilson and Bridget Cook's, about how Black audience, well, Black people, Black audiences, Black curators, intellectuals were really invested in the museum. And I see this as kind of different from the way the American Art Museum or the American Museum approached Black, African, African-American, and African diasporic content and artists as more along the trajectory of spectacle, oddity, the popular, the commercial, and less about the entanglements of citizenship. So these two different positions seem to suggest, for me at least, competing perspectives, approaches, and claims. And so you two, Rujeko and Cameron, represent, for me, on the face of it today, these two sides of the Black experience in the museum, in the art world, historically in the United States. What people see on the one hand as the culturally specific museums versus quote unquote mainstream museums. And so, you know, can we talk about, you know, these dueling positions, or can you talk to me about this, or do you not see that at all? And you say, Kelly, you're just like super off base with this idea.
Obviously not that. Sure, I don't know. I jump in, Cameron. Yeah, I mean, I think what it kind of brings to mind, you know, I've had the experience of, as many of us have, of working in both the quote unquote culturally specific institution and then an institution that's somewhere in the middle, by which I was at the Studio Museum first in my career, then I went to the Brooklyn Museum, which is, I would say, kind of a hybrid institution in some ways. It has elements of both a culturally specific and of a mainstream. And now I work at the Whitney, which is, you know, a mainstream or a, what do they say? PWI? PWI institution. And I think the kind of differences between those kinds of institutions, there's a certain kind of given around my deepest kind of thing that I'm always shocked by is the basic understanding that culturally specific institutions have about audiences and what audiences are interested in and what audiences will show up for. So it was never a question at the Studio Museum, like, if we do it, they will come. And by they, I mean Black people, Black and brown people who may not necessarily feel comfortable at other institutions. The Brooklyn Museum also had the same expectation, although I remember interesting conversations around We Wanted a Revolution and like kind of not a full understanding of like what that show might be. I always think about how that show didn't get like a banner out on the front of the museum. And that's like a small thing, but it's also a big, you know, it's also a meaningful thing. And then at the Whitney, like, I remember we did Toyin Oji-Odetola's show, and it was like, oh my God, the gallery is fuller than it's ever been. And like, who are all these Black people? And again, like, Kelly, you have said this to me before, like, if we build it, we will come, we come, like, we show up, we line up, we come to see the shows, we come to support our curators and our artists. And when we are spoken to in a way that is respectful, we listen. And so I think that's actually true across all types of institutions. It's just whether the institutions are attuned to that and understand it continuously or have to learn it every season again.
Yeah, it's really interesting, Rue, to hear your trajectory, and it makes me think about my own, which was largely outside of museums. So I started my career with some key fellowships and internships in larger institutions, what we might call mainstream institutions, Eurocentric, white-centered, however we might frame them. And that was the Getty and the National Gallery. And then I stepped away. I was in commercial galleries, really sort of thinking deeply about the way that the market influenced what was being produced. And then I was writing. And then I was in New Orleans, and we were building. It was really thinking about arts and culture as part of a rebuilding effort post-Katrina, and in a city that is so deeply Afrocentric and, majority Black in terms of cultural production. So it's fascinating to hear. But, when I think about the history of CAM, it does really resonate with me with this idea of civic work, right? CAM was founded in 1977. So we're a direct outgrowth of the Black Museum movement of the 1960s and 70s, which, created institutions like the Studio Museum, the DeSable Museum, the Charles H. Wright Museum, the Anacostia Community Museum, just to name a few. And that really was, as you point out, fundamentally civic work performed by Black people for Black people. It was the task of identity building, of empowerment, of self-sufficiency, of self-worth, and really thinking about the way the museum functioned alongside other efforts that were happening in the larger arena of civil rights. And something that's really particular about the history of CAM, and I really grapple with this and live with this in very real ways on a daily basis, is, we're also a state-supported museum and a government agency. So we're the first African-American museum of art, history, and culture that was fully supported by a state. And that, like the Black Museum movement, was the direct result of a sustained multi-year campaign of activism, undertaken by truly visionary founders, which included politicians, those who wrote the legislation that secured the funding from the governor's budget, as well as artists, scholars, and other community members who were shaping what the Black Museum might look like. So that adds a really rich layer for me when I think about our institutional positionality, vis-a-vis cultural work as citizenship work. Because it was this really early and tangible recognition that, Black people are important, that we have contributed to, in our case, the American West, the cultural, economic, political development of the state. So in terms of our charge in the present, I feel like that history really informs our approach. And there's actually a photograph at the ribbon cutting of our building in 1984, which was a couple years after our original charter. And I look at this picture like all the time because it says to me that we have to be as visionary in 2022 as our founders were in 1977 to think we should exist, and to really ask ourselves, what does that mean? So, I'm also a proud student of Kellie Jones from Yale. So I love this question because it feels like being in the classroom with you, for one, but allows me to kind of think about some things that I think about in one sense, but other things that I think this conversation is going to resonate with me in the sort of quiet month of December, as I'm, holed up with my family and kind of reflecting on the year. This originating question is a really beautiful one.
I wonder, just to push a little bit further, to think about now, do you, I kind of laid out this position, and I love the way you use the word civic work. That's exactly what it is. So now you've given me that phrase. Thank you, Cameron, because that's exactly, when you talk about, it was one of the things I was so excited about when I read Mabel Wilson's book about, and I had also seen it with, of course, Deb Willis's book, A Small Nation of People, where she talks about Du Bois and the Paris Exposition, but just to see how they really dug in, and even Elaine Locke, and we know about people like James Porter, but just others that just really dug in and said, they were really focused on World's Fairs, right?
Mhm.
Particularly Du Bois, right? And the mechanism of that to create this, as a way to create some kind of civic engagement or as civic work. Or when, Black people were so excited, and this is still in the fair, structure, to get out of the Negro building, right, and into the contemporary art building. I mean, that was the thing with Augusta Savage at the World Fair.
Yeah.
Right? She was not, she was in the contemporary art area, and that was a major thing. But I'm wondering if you agree with me that, the role, say in the early Whitney or even up to today, the role of Black artists as kind of a commercial or spectacle or different thing. Maybe I'm just being too harsh because, of course, I love my American art museums. But, is the role different than this civic work? Is that your understanding of it?
Well, it's interesting because I think it's to work. I mean, even though we're so many years out from it, I think the kind of Du Boisian idea of double consciousness is so prevalent and present in like my experience, and I think many of my peers who work in institutions like the Whitney, because of course the Whitney was founded in this tradition of civic work, but it's a different tradition of civic work by, Gloria Vanderbilt Whitney was an artist. She was a patron. She was a socialite. She founded the Whitney because the Met refused her collection, of American art. She'd been building it for 25 years, and that was like, we don't, American art, like, what is that? We don't do that. Nobody cares about that. So she, being a woman of means and, good chutzpah, born of means and of personality, decided to make her own museum. And so in that founding collection, were there any Black artists? I actually don't know, but if there were, it was around 700 works. I'm sure there were very few Black artists, if any. I'm sure there were very few non-white artists. I'm sure there were very few women artists. And so, but that founding of the institution was very much something that was predicated on an understanding that we have to build our own. And by we, she meant Americans, right? And so it's, again, the we now is Black Americans. Where do we fit into that other we? And like, if this institution was not, it was founded in a kind of, the Whitney is also, is different than the Met or MoMA or the Brooklyn Museum, in that it was founded in the 20th century, and it was founded in a different kind of, it has a different kind of trajectory than the other kind of institutions that are kind of peer, I mean, as in terms of like PWI organizations. But so it's kind of hard to parse, because on the one hand, I do see that and I hold that as true and as not only well-intentioned, but as really realized. But on the other hand, of course, like, Black people couldn't vote in 1930 when the museum was founded. Like, Black people couldn't live freely in the North or the South in 1930 when the museum was founded. Like, it's like Harlem Renaissance is happening in 1930. Like, Aaron Douglas is not in the founding collection. Like, we still don't have at the Whitney a work by Aaron Douglas. Like, yes, in 2022. And, and so I think like the Harlem Renaissance actually is, interestingly, kind of doesn't really appear in the Whitney's collection in a meaningful way, which, when you kind of think about that, you're like, okay, Gloria Vanderbilt Whitney is like downtown, she's on 8th Street, she's like doing her thing, she's hanging out with artists, she's having a great time. Does she not go uptown? Does she not know about uptown? It's not necessarily because she's, look at someone like Nancy Cunard, she's uptown, like there were white ladies up there. So it's like, she could have known if she had wanted to, and those pieces could have been in the collection if that had been her interest or her experience, but it wasn't. And so it sets up, from the very beginning, there's omissions in the collection that 100 years later, almost, we're still trying to fill. And people like me are like, hey, super weird that like all of these really important artists, like Lois Bayou Jones is in a show right now at the Whitney, Barbara Haskell's collection show on the 8th floor. I don't know if she's ever been seen in the building before. Like these really iconic artists, period, artists, but like Black artists very specifically, that Black art historians and curators have known and discussed and taught and shared and valued for generations. So the question of spectacle, it's like the first Black artists have solo shows at the Whitney were in the 1970s, and they were not coincidentally artists working in abstraction. Alma Thomas, the first Black woman to have a show at the Whitney. Jack Whitten, folks like that, Frank Bowling, all of whom, of course, are incredible artists, but there's like the tension between abstraction and abstraction and figuration. There's like a lot of different tensions there. And I think, it's like the spectacle part. I don't know if that applies at the Whitney, because the Whitney was so, it's like contemporary Black artists in America in 1971, like was protested by artists. Artists pulled their work out of the show because the Black curator was not involved, and the Whitney didn't really listen to or attend to the kind of concerns that were raised repeatedly by folks like Benny Andrews, among others. So it's kind of hard, because it's like if you can't even like where there's not even the spectacle if there's not even the shows. If that makes sense.
Yeah, it's interesting, this question of does it apply, right? Because on a very basic level, we have to acknowledge that to some degree, Black life is still a spectacle in America. Like, we are still living in this condition of both hypervisibility and total invisibility.
Absolutely.
Which is what these scholars and these curators have been grappling with. And I think the question of where Black abstraction fits in this, to me, it's so rich actually, because of the way it offers this counterpoint, this place to explore, to think about legibility, to think about visibility, to think about surveillance, even as, we live in a different state than those abstractionists were beginning in, but one where surveillance really still is a major condition of how we think about Black life. But then also, I think it's so complex because the question of spectacle, right? The World's Fair, by its very nature, was the space of spectacle. So these theorists, they were using this space because of what it offered about the potential to disseminate ideas. So it's rich, and it's really, really complex.
Yeah, I'm also going to circle back, because like some of the earliest Black people in Whitney are Black artists are Barté and Richmond Barté and Nancy Elizabeth Prophet, and they do come in early on.
Yeah.
But then when you start reading how it came in and all this other stuff is a whole other idea. But just thinking about, that is the work of its time. You know, the Black body, muscly Black body, Barté, it's kind of really, it's really a queer aesthetic now that we can say that. In the
well, and like
museum.
Nugent is in the Whitney's collection also, and same kind of idea.
Yeah. But I don't know if he got there early. I don't know. Maybe he did. All these people are around. I think Barté, that's a whole other thing. Prophet also. But it's like a one-off, right?
Yeah.
You get one piece in, you don't get a show, right? Early on. So, there, it becomes this kind of, we'll do this, because, and then again, I think in the 70s, again, with protest, people, get into the museum as, a fail-safe, and then it gets closed again, just to answer those things in a few shows. But now I think, all these things have really changed somewhat. I hope that, yes, the museum is partially spectacle, but, do we continue with that, or do we continue with, actually thinking about art's histories and a greater kind of in-depth look at artists? I'm going to ask this next question to Cameron, which is, I think we're witnessing greater cultural literacy around the work of Black artists today. At the same time, American museums and those around the globe are hiring more diverse curatorial staff and even directors. And I'm thinking of Elvira Dayangani Ose, the director of MACBA in Barcelona. Of course, Franklin Sermons at the Paris Art Museum in Miami, and of course, nearby in New York, Naomi Beckwith as the deputy director of the Guggenheim and chief curator. So, Cameron, specifically, given that, what might your hopes and dreams be for culturally specific institutions such as CAM? Or again, am I setting up this, somebody younger should have done this because, or somebody who wasn't, head in the art history books should have done this to say, no, these things are not at odds as I'm thinking of it. How are you thinking about these things as museums begin to change in the ways, again, one of the things when people are protesting in the 60s, to go back to Rue's We Want a Revolution show, they want artists in the museum. They want artists to have shows. They want Black curators. That doesn't even happen for another 40 years.
Yeah.
30 years. Thelma does it, right?
Yeah.
Thelma Golden. It's shocking that one question really doesn't get answered for decades. And then, trickling, well, Lowry, there's a couple of people, but then Kiniston McShine at MoMA. But then, here we are in the 2000s, it's like 50 years later. And, it's like the door opens and all these people go. So I'm wondering how you're feeling about that, Cameron in particular, and of course, Ru can weigh in, with, the museum world as we encounter it today in 2022, with that happening and given that CAM as such a wonderful culturally specific institution and around for its own decades, right?
Right. Again, I think it's like, how do we hold this paradox of multiple truths at the same time? When I look at Ru, and Ru and I are in other rooms together, and I look around those rooms, it's beautiful and astonishing that we are all here doing this work that we're called to. And, I think many of us would say we wouldn't be here if it wasn't for you, if it wasn't for Thelma, if it wasn't for Lowry. We name that often, right? But by the same token, the movement that created CAM as a museum is, people are still in the streets protesting, right? And many of the things that they were protesting then, America remains in racial crisis. And, I just want to name that because there is so much progress. And yet, we are still speaking to the violence of white supremacy and anti-Blackness. So the originating principle for CAM to me is as relevant and vital to a healthy and just America as it ever was. And to me, that's the work of building and supporting inclusive, accessible, dynamic spaces where people can just fundamentally see Black lives, cultures, and experiences valued and reflected, which we still don't see enough. So I want to start there. But, like I said, it's this paradox, right? We can recognize that the work of our museum, it doesn't mean the same thing in 1977 as it does in 2022. So I think the core question that I'm asking all the time is, what is a Black museum in the year 2022, right? And, for us, more specifically, what is the shape of that work in a place like Los Angeles, right? We're a major metropolis. We're a center for cultural production of all kinds, cultural production like television and film, which is foregrounding Black voices in ways that were unimaginable. And, we're also in one of the most racially and ethnically diverse cities in the world. And as you point out, many museums have made institutional pledges to diversity, which is part of a trajectory of inclusion, but also, a real pointed moment in 2020 where these pledges were put on paper, where people, folks spoke to a shift, and we see a change in the way that I think Black curators are being centered, but also Black artists are being centered, and so many institutions, I think, are making good progress on those pledges, and that's necessary and laudable work, and it's something that I really believe in. But this same time period allows us to continue to clarify and grapple with our own role, right? and there's so much more that I think we can be modeling as Black institution that is the healing and liberation of Black folk and Black creativity, right, and Black histories, which I think, by extension is the healing and liberation of all people. So to that end, I'm super interested in new models and new methodologies of how do we think holistically about how to support Black creativity. What are the financial models? What are the administrative support systems? Like, how are we thinking about doing this work as part of an emotional and intellectual support for Black artists? And at the same time, how are we deeply contextualizing this work and the work of Black artists and scholars and other cultural producers? Because I think that's something that we're also uniquely positioned to do. So, some of the ways that it's taking shape, we'll, soon be introducing a new residency program for Black California artists with research-based practices. And, the way we've structured it, I think it offers really a kind of unprecedented level of financial support, which includes yearly stipends for the artists who are working on major projects, which, exceeds California's living wage, on top of really significant and open-ended project outcome support. And that's really this idea that the Black Museum can be a midwife, right? That there are still radical ideas that need to enter into the world, and how can we be in a role to help birth them, through the artist lens. We're experimenting with different kinds of partnership models, like our 5-year museum and residence collaboration with Art and Practice, and that brings CAM curated exhibitions and programs to a historically Black and very vibrant neighborhood of Limerick Park in Los Angeles, which has a different and intersecting history to our home, our main campus in Exposition Park. And then, we're also kind of thinking about new opportunities to support, the sustained dialogue of Black life and the most pressing issues of our time. Like, where is the museum in these conversations? And I think the Black Museum can be in a particular role, to think about ideas about something like environmental justice, which again is interesting for CAM as a state-supported museum. We're functioning under the umbrella of the Natural Resource Agency. And, that includes colleagues that steward state parks and beaches, that manage fire and drought, that protect our state's wildlife. So it's an incredible privilege, I think, to be a museum that's in regular conversation and hearing from those that are on the front lines of, environmental conservation and crisis management in a state that's, mind you, leading the nation on those issues. So how do we leverage that position? So, that's perhaps a long way of saying that I think my hope and dream is that Black museums, that culturally specific institutions, and I am in conversation with other culturally specific institutions that support other communities to think about how we're doing this work alongside one another and in conversation with one another. But that we keep experimenting, that we keep being open to reinvention and adaptation to the calls of the moment, and that we really keep this, the spirit of radicality that I talked about with our founders, that, that they brought to their boundary breaking work. We've got to bring that to the present.
Wow, an amazing answer, Cameron. And I'm going to keep that in my heart, because people have talked about it in, how these, things need to go away. But in fact, what you're saying is, hey, we have so many roles to play, and roles that, again, fold out into the needs of not only these communities, but the world, the state, the country, the world. And so
yeah, I don't believe we need to go. I believe we need to be leading the charge, right? Yeah. Like, as museums are now finally thinking about what it means to center Black voices. Well, we've been doing that for 40 years. So what's the next frontier? What do we want to model for those institutions that maybe, they pick up hopefully more quickly than 40 years later after we've done that work? Or, as you point out, for many of the folks you were talking about, 100 years later after we've been doing that work. So, yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm super struck because I think, like, healing and liberation are not part of the missions of most museums. They are not. And I think what is super profound for me to listen to you, Cameron, talk is that like it is also, it's you and it's the way you've been leading CAM. And like one of the greatest honors of my life really was that We Want a Revolution went to CAM, because I so wanted it to be at a culturally specific institution. I wanted it to be at a Black museum because I know what that means and I know the difference. But it's like so profound for me to hear you speak in this way, because no matter how much I think institutions like the Whitney are kind of moving towards the place that you are already at and have been, there is like this fundamental like difference, because that is not part of the mission. It just isn't. And like, doesn't mean that that is not of interest and of deep care and concern to individual staff members of all race and ethnicities. But as an institution, it's like, I don't know. And so without that, like, what do we then, how do we engage with communities that have a history of disenfranchisement and violence based on their race or ethnicity? And how do we have a community kind of based approach when we actually, what is the community of the Whitney? You know, that question is very easy to answer for CAM. It is very difficult to answer for the Whitney. I think the Whitney's answer would be something like artists are our community, but like, what does that mean? And obviously, as we know, there is so much variety on every scale you can imagine in artists, and which is not to say that's a bad thing. Like, I love artists. I very much, that's one of the things I love about the Whitney, is that artists are really at the center of it and have always been from the founding. But you know, there's no like grounding, kind of, whether it's geographically, whether it's a kind of experientially, like a shared experience, a shared history, in the way that there is for somewhere like CAM. So yeah, and then I've, you know, going through the like 2020 to now, when, you know, the protests around George Floyd's murder and the ways in which institutions kind of sprang into action, and now where we are kind of a couple of years later, and the kind of reticence, because as you pointed out, we are in racial crisis, but we have always been in racial crisis. When have we not been in racial crisis? And so the option of being like tired of that conversation, or like, oh, we've already said something about that, doesn't exist for an institution like CAM, and it doesn't exist for a person like me, but it might exist for an institution where a person like me works, which is always, you know, the tension.
Let me turn to you now, Ru, about you co-curated the Whitney Biennial in 2019, and Adrian Edwards co-curated the one this year. Mm-hmm. And so what is your assessment of that impact on you as a curator, on the world of American art? Were you indeed the first Black curator to curate a biennial at the Whitney? I didn't go through my quick research before this, but I think I'm right.
Yeah, well, and you know, I will also add that Meg Only is an Angelino is curating the next iteration with Chrissy Isles. So that's actually 3 Black curators in a row.
Three-peat.
I know, it's already, that's its own very interesting thing. You know, Thelma Golden was part of the curatorial team for the 93 biennial. And it was, you know, the way the Whitney has approached the biennial over the years, it changes. You know, at that time in the 90s, it was really a team approach. Like there would be, you know, like a curator from film and video. There would be, you know, Elizabeth Sussman was kind of actually the main curator, the officially main curator of that biennial. And I think Thelma was like a curatorial assistant at the time, or I'm not sure of her title, but she was kind of an assistant on that biennial, but I think, of course, had a lot of input and was given, and you know, took a platform that she obviously deserved. But I do think, like, based on that, officially, yes, I would be the first, like, kind of marquee, if you will, like, these 2 people are doing this show together. But you know, when I was asked, I was like, oh, it's Thelma, and then it's me. And you know, I think people think about it that way, but it's like, it almost is like a moot point, because it's like, okay, well, if you're the first or if you're the second, the first was in 93. I was asked to do the biennial in 2017. Like that's a lot of time to pass in a world in which these conversations were very, you know, you were working, Kelly, many artists, many curators, like between 1993 and 2017, it's not like it was like, oh, we didn't know about this conversation. No, of course we did. So, my assessment of the impact on me as a curator, as a person, I mean, it was immense. Like the biennial is the hardest thing I've ever done, is the most kind of amazing thing I've ever done, the most, all of the superlatives, and in the way that our specific biennial kind of unfolded, the tear gas biennial, if you will. Didn't expect that and could not have predicted that. But yeah, an incredibly profound impact. I think as far as on the kind of broader conversation in the context of this the three of us conversation, Jane, I was really blessed with an incredible co-curator. Jane Panetta is an incredible person and curator and friend, and deep thinker and deep strategic thinker, I should say, and a person with whom I was able to be fully myself, and fully say all the things that I wanted to do, and the reasons and the agendas that were larger than kind of just this show, that were about, okay, we know so many things come into the collection from biennials. We know that it matters who we visit, because word spreads. We know that it matters how we use this platform, and it matters beyond us. And I think Jane is a person who, really understands, is a historical thinker, and really understood, like, we are in a legacy just because you are a Black curator. Now our biennial is in a different kind of legacy than somebody else's might be. And I'm like game for that. And I'm excited about that. And I'm going to be like a co-conspirator with you about that, not just about this exhibition. So I was I was really, really happy. I don't know if I would have wanted to do the biennial with anybody, but I really wanted to do it with Jane because I already knew that about her. So, it was over. It was, what did we say, majority minority? It was a majority minority exhibition. And of course it was, because that's the world that I grew up in as a curator. That is the world I know. That's the only world I've ever been engaged in professionally. And so we didn't have like a list of like, oh, we got to balance, we got to have this many. We just did the show we did. And at some point looked up and we're like, okay, someone from PR is going to come and ask us for the data. So let's look at it. And it was what we knew it would be, because again, this is the world that we live in. It wasn't a stretch to do that. But I think it impacts the institution in all sorts of ways, because everybody you bring into the biennial intersects with every part of the institution. They become a part of the legacy and the history of that exhibition. They're in the collection, they do programs, they do, education, teen, adult programs, like they do all, they engage. It's like the beginning of an engagement. They go on to have other shows. I've done Jennifer Packer's show. She was in the biennial. The show that it came from the Serpentine Gallery in London. They told us very directly that they came to the biennial and they saw Jennifer's work in the biennial, and they were like, she's ready to have a solo show, and they invited her. And so there's this way in which the platform of the biennial, and there's so many other artists Black artists very specifically, who've had like kind of crazy trajectories. Tiana McCloudon is another great example of kind of coming out of the biennial. And obviously it's chance, it's incredibly hard work. It's the person at the right time with the right person seeing their work. But I think I was very simultaneously like naive. I now see I was quite naive about how the market intersects with the biennial, and how, like I knew it intellectually, but to live in it and see it, I was like shocked over and over again, which is how I know I'm still a little bit naive, which is okay. It's okay to be a little naive sometimes. Yeah.
Great. Well, wow, our conversation is flying. I'm like, could talk with you guys all day, but I want to kind of ask what might be our last question. Who knows? I'm energized by the changes in American and global museum culture. What else still needs to be done?
I think that what needs to be done is philanthropy and the way that philanthropy intersects with institutions and the arts. I think there's been so much work at institutions, but we haven't fundamentally changed. You know, museums are part of the colonial enterprise. You know, we are as in their invention, right? And so is philanthropy. But I think museums talk a lot more, in my experience, obviously I'm not in philanthropy, but talk a lot more about what that means, and how to kind of shift and kind of push back against that history and kind of be mindful of that. And I just am like, how do we work on healing and liberation when at the end of the day, we are just like in a cycle of funding that's connected to deeply destructive forces in the world? And Cameron knows this because we are in another collective group, and I feel like I'm always like, but philanthropy.
But it's spot on, right? And like, the museum is of the world, right? Like, as you point, like it is a colonial institution. It is of the world in which we live, and it's intertwined. And so this role of where money and power function in the museum and shape the museum, I think really is this incredible frontier of potential work, and how philanthropy shifts to adjust to, I think, a different reality and a different demand around clarity, transparency, acknowledging need differently, but also, you know, recognizing the paradox of that. Like, how do we also live in a moment of resource redistribution at the same time that we can recognize, you know, the problem of where our money comes from is not going to be solved in our lifetime, right? It's embedded in the way our country was built. It's embedded in the nature of capitalism as it is expressed in this moment. But to think about what are the shifts in the conversations that are happening, I think is really, really interesting. And I can say that I'm having some really edifying conversations around shifts in philanthropy, and I'm curious what the future holds. And as you know, we think about building CAM, we're in the process of building a foundation. You know, we are a government entity, but we are building a foundation alongside. And one of the things I'm really thinking about is, you know, how do we build a set of museum trustees? And is it possible to do that with a Black radical politic? I don't know yet, but I think that's the thing that I'm going to be grappling with in the coming years, as I recognize, you know, we have this great privilege because of our stability as a state institution to right size our needs, right? It's different to think about how to build a group of trustees or a trustee structure when you're not having to keep the lights on of your institution or to fund commitments that you've already made, or historical commitments that represent the size of your institution and the way it functions, right? So we could do this really interesting work because we're fundamentally right-sizing ourselves, and we have the ability to do that. But, you know, I also have great ambitions, right? Like, I believe that CAM deserves a new building. Like, that is, in this day and age, $100 million, $200 million capital campaign. So how do I do this work with recognizing the realities of, you know, how I get money
exactly
in this world? So it's complex. And then, you know, Ru mentioned, you know, our ability to see one another in another group, and, you know, to think about the conversations that are happening amongst Black arts workers, but also thinking about the movement that has happened, just like, you know, Kellie, as you pointed out, the shifts of curators and institutions, the changing of directors, sort of where Black arts workers and curators and new directors, especially in the past few years, are in this is, you know, how do we create supportive structures, you know, both within our institutions and across the field that, you know, ensure our success. And I'm not sure what those look like entirely. I think especially at this time, because we as a society are also grappling with this idea of like the nature of work has so dramatically changed because of our experience collectively of the pandemic. And, you know, we're also exhausted by these events and the lived experiences. But it's really on my mind about the resources that I need and the kinds of structures that my colleagues need. And also how am I as a leader of an institution helping to create structure for others, and that feels like really, really hard work right now. But when I think about what still needs to be done, it really is the relationship of museum work as work, and supporting especially people of color in the changes that have been made. How do we support and sustain? And then, you know, something that has just been something I'm following, which I think is so interesting in this idea of the Museum of the Future, especially as you bring up, Ru, with this idea of the colonial model, is, you know, it's not core to our work, but as I look at the field, I'm deeply interested in how museums, especially encyclopedic museums, are grappling with the issues and ethics of repatriation and the return of objects to their communities of origin. And, you know, even sort of just, you know, in my news feed this morning, the challenge to the Smithsonian repatriation of the Benin bronzes, from a Black legal scholar thinking about like the relationship between the transatlantic slave trade and Black reparations, and sort of how do we think about those objects in that conversation. And, you know, that's not something I know enough about to weigh in, but it was in my newsfeed this morning, and I was like, God, another fascinating layer, and one that I personally had not considered. And then, you know, when we think about institutions that do present objects of different cultures, you know, how are we continuing to think about new hangings and, you know, the stories that are told through a decolonial lens or with the relational histories at the fore? You know, how do we think about art objects telling, and the power of art objects to tell fuller histories, to tell more manifold stories? So that's something also that I think about when I think about what needs to be done, is how museums are relating to those ideas.
Large questions about, you know, repatriation that I think a lot of my colleagues who work specifically with African objects and in those contexts are really grappling with in much, you know, greater ways than I think. I still enjoy going to the museum and seeing everything, but if it's a time that it comes to pass that some of those things leave, you just have to put up a picture and tell people about it, or have an opportunity to go see it in other locations, I imagine. Are there any words you want to leave our guests with, our lovely audience that has been with us for the last hour on this topic?
I have a question for you, Kellie. Are we allowed to ask questions? Well, yeah. Kellie, because I mean, as Cameron said, I think there are many more of us now, but none of us would be here without the work of your generation and your parents' generation. Actually, you are kind of uniquely positioned. And so I'm just very curious about your kind of arc of engagement with the world of art, and specifically Black art and Black culture, and how you see the shifts over not necessarily your lifetime, your professional lifetime, and where we are now. Like, what do you think the future of kind of Black art and Black art spaces is?
I love that question, Ru.
It's very hard. I haven't thought about it. Well, that's why I'm speaking to you all, because I really have, I don't want to say I have not a clue. I'm really a student of, you know, these days of history. Of course, you all, you know, I'm still doing things, but I don't know. But whatever it is, I trust the next generation. You know, I think it was enough to that those generations in the 60s, you know, fought for these things and got, you know, these great objects finally in some of these museums. It was a start, as you say, Ru. Some of these things, you know, there are still holes that may or may not be filled. You know, of course, the Jean-Michel Basquiat example comes to mind. So starkly, because there are very few museums with amazing paintings, right? But I guess it's just like the relay race, you know. I think for me, it's to write about those things and then to do shows like Now Dig This and also to prove or witness at the Brooklyn Museum, Basquiat at the Brooklyn Museum, love working.
Energy experimentation at the Studio Museum. I mean, the list goes on, Kelly.
Energy experimentation at studio, working at studio. But I think what that example of my work as a curator proved, even to myself, was that everybody wants to see this, right? Just like hip hop, that's my example, just like jazz. People want to see it. I mean, when, you know, there were lines around the block for Basquiat, for Now Dig This, after a while, I was just like, yeah, okay. You're not telling me anything I don't know. But I think to prove that to the museum world, nationally and internationally, I think was a great it was a great honor for me to do that. And then to finally feel like all those things, I mean, I was doing some of these shows, as you know, while working, like Samela Lewis, by the way, as an academic, full-time since '99, and doing shows. And I haven't done a show in 10 years almost, because the world has changed. And because the institutions have changed and world institutions have changed. The Serpentine, we can keep going. And that, I guess, was the goal. So now I leave it to everybody else to figure out all these things about repatriation and, you know, how you know, deal with audiences now. How do you sustain audiences in a changing world? And so I'm leaving that up to you, and it couldn't be in better hands than you two and all your colleagues. So thank you for that question. And I think we are going to sign off 2 minutes early with that. And I really thank you, Rujeko, Hockley, Cameron Shaw. It's a pleasure to be in conversation with you. And I look forward to that continuing.
Thank you so much
Thanks
for
to
having
the
us.
Luce Foundation too. Yeah,
Thank you so much, Kelly. And yeah, thank you to the Luce Foundation and to the lots of people who came.